Hey y'all, just a quick reminder before we get started to like, comment, and subscribe if you're not already. Alright, well, now that that's out of the way, let's get to the story. The Houses of Night, an original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Victor Smith sat behind his grandfather's mahogany desk, chewing thin lips as he eyed the unopened Navy letter. He stopped mulling and clenched his jaw, leaning forward in his grandfather's high back, fingers twining before he stuck his thumbs between his teeth. He sighed and reread the sender, scrolled in gold. Ewan McConnell, one of the richest and most mysterious men alive. Victor raked fingers through dirty blonde curls and spun the chair around to stare at his grandfather's bookshelves, floor to ceiling on every wall. His grandfather had been a successful businessman, leaving Victor sole inheritor given his father had died shortly before his birth. He would have known what to do if he received a letter from McConnell, but Victor? No. Victor was 35 with a useless degree that he'd paid off with his inheritance. He'd been a laborer, waiter, even homeless for a few years. He respected money, like his grandfather had taught him, but he was no businessman. Even with his grandfather's associates and business partners, even inheriting a pool of wealthy clients and successful stocks, he didn't know how to keep it all going. He was a worker, not a leader, which wasn't shameful, but it might see his grandfather's legacy ruined before 40, and that would be shameful. He growled, leaning back and arms draping over the sides before he squeezed his eyes, sucked in a slow breath, and spun around. He picked up the envelope and tore it open, unfolding Mr. McConnell's invitation to join him on an all-night round trip to his island home. Victor stared through the paper before he blinked and scanned the words twice more. You've been selected from an exclusive pool of candidates to attend a night-long party and meeting with Mr. McConnell, Victor read to himself, and a chance to see his home on Sage's Isle. He set the invitation down, glossing over the gold embellishment and letterwork across the navy field. Then he swallowed and furrowed his brows, running over the words again before he stood and left through the office's archway for the library beyond, where many a party had been had. He mightn't have had business sense, but Victor had brains enough to seek counsel from his grandfather's friends about this. After 3 days of deliberation, Victor replied to his invitation, and the next day flew to southern Maine. The drive to Grabshore was long and boring, save for the increase in cold and snow the closer to the shore they came. Apparently no one told the town it was summer, as, having arrived, snow still piled the roadsides, fallen from overcast skies, and the people were bundled like it were 15 below. Having boarded with the other 11 guests, they left their luggage with Mr. McConnell's staff for their rooms. They each signed a mandatory NDA and statement claiming they understood Mr. McConnell wasn't liable for any potential bodily harm. Then, after the stylus's final stroke, everything went quiet as the guests looked around, the more observant watching the staff raise the bridge and shut the gate in the ship's side rails as the engines rumbled to life. Victor stood removed from the rest, who meandered between each other. He leaned on the port railing, hands in his black leather jacket as the sea tossed a razor wind in his face that blew back his hair. He shivered, dressed in black wool slacks and socks as he was, and eyed the people and ship. It was just big enough to give everyone ample space without feeling empty, but the stuff of its make was enough to impress. Polished wooden desks and white walls turned red and cream in the sunset behind Victor. The stained wood of the sitting area amid the front deck, open on one side to minimize the wind with a fully stocked bar in back. The 3 decks above, each with balconies facing front and covered walkways all around, lights glittering from inside every window. Someone, a middle-aged woman, asked one of the staff if the bar was open. The beautiful young woman smiled and was about to speak when a man appeared on the balcony above the sitting area. He was tall, broad-shouldered and handsome with a physique bleeding through his fitted cream button-up and green slacks. Wind rustled his shoulder-length black curls as he spread large hands across the rail and leaned forward with a booming greeting that pulled everyone's eyes to him. Before we ship off, I have one thing I must tell you. Tonight will be full of adventure, even a little danger. So if you're not up for it, tell one of my staff and they'll let you off. He waited a moment, laughing as some of the guests joked that they'd never miss the chance to see his home. Indeed. He clapped his hands and looked around with a wide smile. Then cast off, Martin. We can't afford to be late. A young man in uniform, navy polo and black pants, responded without looking up, sending hand signals to the other staff before he pulled something out of his pants pocket. Their host spun and dashed into a dining hall before coming out the walk and down a set of stairs for the deck. We'll be underway soon. Please remember, no photos or video of the island, on approach or dock, understood? Everyone did, or should have, if they'd read the terms. Then the ship shook and jolted forward, slowly carving through the frigid wind to leave the shore behind. Victor stayed where he was and studied the other guests as Ewan McConnell greeted everyone. Lesser knowns pulled together and eyed the famous. Those kept healthy distances from each other. Then the desperate clamored after Ewan with 100 questions. But he answered and laughed, shaking every man's hand and kissing every lady's, making sure he'd seen every guest. He called for everyone to have a drink from the bar, reminding them to not get so drunk as to fall overboard. Victor turned around to watch the sunset, shivering in the absence of cold before someone spoke beside him. Ewan leaned on the rail, back to the sun and eyes golden as he held out a hand. He smiled. I don't believe we've had the pleasure. Victor grinned and shook his hand, a firm grip that he matched. No, Victor Smith. Ah, Nathan's boy. His angular face turned somber before he offered a friendly smile, hand dropping. I was sorry to hear of his passing. I'm his grandson, but thank you. He was a great man. Indeed. We weren't friends, but I admired your grandfather. Strong as a bull to the end, I hear. Victor laughed. That he was. Strong and stubborn. You'd never guess he had cancer unless you knew the signs. Cancer? Is that what took your father? Before he could answer, a young man, Martin, approached and apologized before addressing Ewan. He held out a stack of cards, big as tarot, with elaborate gold and white designs on the backs. Oh, thank you. Are they ordered? Martin nodded. Excellent. Victor, if you'll excuse me, I have a matter needs attending before dinner. Of course. Ewan nodded with a distracted grin, then walked off. Victor turned a little, hands re-pocketed as he looked on the gray nightish sky ahead and kept his ears fixed. They were just far enough away that Victor could only hear a few words through the wind, commenting on the cards. They motioned with their hands, nodding and chuckling to one another before the wind finally died. Good. This should be a standard trip, but make the pig ready in case we have a jumper. Martin chuckled and nodded. Yes, sir. Oh, Chef says dinner's almost ready. Ewan nodded with a pat to his shoulder, and they parted, cards sliding into Ewan's pants pocket. House 1. Not 10 minutes later, dinner was served. Lamb, not pork, with everyone seated amid the dining hall Ewan had spoken from earlier. Victor sat near the foot, grateful the balcony doors were shut to the cold. Dinner was full of laughter and business alike. Covert jabs and prods passed like compliments as they boasted. He knew that he should listen and play the game, but he'd hoped to watch the sunset. That, though, set before they ate, leaving the world black save the ship lights. Then Ewan clinked his glass and stood, garnering everyone's eye, hands clasped at his back. My honored guests, I thank you all for attending. Not going to bed so early, are you? An old skinny man asked, sparking low chuckles. Certainly not, Benjamin, but I'm afraid I lied earlier. There's one thing left to announce. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You weren't invited from the goodness of my heart, nor even a tax write-off. They all chuckled. I mentioned earlier excitement and potential danger. Tonight, you'll face your deepest fears. Victor furrowed his brows with a nervous grin, but before the others could raise laughs, Ewan continued. No jokes. With your signatures, you agreed to participate in a ritual to placate the mind of a sleeping titan. Tonight, you'll witness your fears manifest and confront them. Whether you overcome them or are consumed is up to you, but there is no escape. What are you on about? A young woman asked. Then the gingerhead man beside her joined. What kind of game are you playing? No games. When the sun set, we sailed out of the waters of the waking world for the black seas of the creature's mind. Here our dreams and terrors become true. You'll face them to entertain it. In fact, we've already sailed half of the first house without much activity. Let's go on deck to officially begin. You're really not joking, are you? The old man, Benjamin, asked. The ginger man laughed and stood with a screech of his chair. You're crazed as the rumors say. He spun and gawked at everyone. Go on. What's our biggest fears? A crashed market? One woman joked, and everyone chuckled. Ewan sighed and motioned to one of the staff standing aside, a young woman. She nodded and left through the swiveling doors behind him, eyes sparking with irritation. Victor swallowed and moved uncomfortably in his seat, looking around as he ignored the image of his grandfather's coffin being lowered into the earth. He blinked it away and stood to say something, but cut it short, as two staff pushed through and held the swivel doors open. Then Victor jumped back with wide eyes as everyone scrambled from the table. 3 things walked out, stopping a few feet before the doors. Minotaurs. They were tall and muscled with huge cow heads, black cloth tied on their slender hips to the knees of their cow legs, with aprons the only thing covering muscled chests. Short, sharp horns curled over twitching ears, and tusks from 2 of their mouths. Tails swished behind them as the one in front, fur black on his head, chest, and legs, snorted and looked around with burning blue eyes. You called, Mr. McConnell? His voice was deep and strange. The female, evident from her breasts, smirked, fur black as the other. To save some breath, I take it. All 3 laughed and stepped forward, nodding to the trembling crowd. The other male, fur ruddy and speckled white, caught and held Victor's eye, then smirked and stared until they were beside Ewan. Our guests wanted to tell you how much they enjoyed your cooking, Ewan said. Oh, really? The Black Bull asked. And I wanted to compliment you and your crew. As always, Cyrus, the food and service is prompt and phenomenal. Ewan smiled as he bowed slightly. The creatures smiled and inclined their enormous heads, muscles bulging in their thick necks and shoulders. Then they found the 12 guests, the Red Bull landing on Victor again, and quirked their brows. Victor licked his lips and found the Black Bull before he pushed himself up on the back of a chair, somehow on the other side of the table. The Minotaurs landed on him and grinned. I don't know, what's going on, but whatever you put in our food must be the best drugs I've never heard of. They stared with Ewan and chuckled. I think that's the best we could expect given the circumstances. The Black Bull inclined his head to Victor. I'm glad you enjoyed the meal. Shall I prepare the swine? Yes, the serpent's been surprisingly absent, Ewan said. Alive? The female asked, and Ewan nodded before the 3 bowed and left the way they'd come. Ewan faced his guests as Victor swallowed, blinking away the blur at vision's edge, and stepping forward with a nervous chuckle. Their host spread his arms out as if nothing had happened. Let's go on deck. What is going on? A young man shrieked, rushing forward. What was that? What's going on? He stared at Ewan a moment, pink v-neck darkening with sweat before he straightened, quivered, and threw himself at the balcony's glass doors. Let us out! There's no returning the way we came, Ewan called over the mounting murmur from the guests. There's only forward. We will sail through each of the 12 houses of night, and in each a fear will manifest, each nightmare ending with the hour. Victor steadied himself, looking out the glass doors as the man stood straight and turned, eyes wild, face twisting as he pushed through the crowd. Victor would have stepped around to stop him, but then something screamed. Everyone stopped. Everyone turned and furrowed their brows at a low boom, then a squeal as a pig crashed into the water 20 yards out. "Pull to open," Ewan said with a chuckle. Someone tried them, and the seal broke. Then everyone crowded the balcony and walkway, wrapping the deck, the air suddenly humid and still. Victor shoved to the front, grunting at an elbow in his side, sending his face down toward the staff on deck, mostly human, but with other things, minotaurs, and things with horse or goat's heads in their legs and tails. Navy's skirts draped their hips to the knee, and the rest of them were bare, even the women. "Port!" one called, lifting a machine gun but not aiming. The rest followed suit as everyone turned to the left of the ship. Spotlights blazed from somewhere overhead, bouncing off the surface of the water, black but reflecting like gasoline. It stirred around the pig as it fought to stay afloat, squealing and thrashing, before something else slithered underneath. Victor furrowed his brows and leaned over the rail to see better, furrowing more when some of the guests rushed onto deck. He looked back, and most of the party had gone, the rest realizing too and rushing away as Ewan gestured them through the door amid the sidewall. Victor looked between them and the water, catching Ewan's eye before he gripped the rail to keep the high vantage. Something broke the surface as one of the women trembled and backed away with a whimper, drowned in squeals. A broad oval skull, pale as snow, with eyes bright as Ewan's, rose and rose on a column neck covered in glittering scales. The woman backed to the other side of the ship, bumping into the staff as she did until she hit the railing and pointed wordlessly. The giant snake tilted its head, fixed eyes on the pig, and lunged in a huge splash, mouth open and enveloping its prey. The woman screamed, legs failing as she pushed to keep upright, gasping and panting with eyes bulging off her face. Everyone else was silent, though they'd backed into the middle of the deck. Then Victor shivered as the ship wobbled in waves, and the water roiled red. The broad head resurfaced, unblinking golden eyes washed crimson like its scales. It sat there a moment, looking at Victor, the rail, then swam closer to slither up the side of the ship. "It won't hurt you." Victor jumped as Ewan came beside him and leaned on the railing. "This is a trip, right? Through the mind of a monster older than our eldest civilizations, yes." His golden eyes flashed in an ambient light that came from nowhere. "Snakes are one of humanity's most primal fears, did you know?" The woman screamed, and Victor whirled to watch the snake flick its long tongue over the deck. The other guests all parted and skittered away with grunts and groans as the staff lifted their guns and the woman pulled herself away on the rail with a twisted face. "Hold steady," Ewan called, bending in half to lean on the rail and swirl his glass of whiskey. "The animal ones are always the tamest. It's the conceptual fears that are a surprise." "Mrs. Clark!" The mess of a woman was gone, making Ewan chuckle and swirl his drink as the snake flicked its tongue after her. "Never mind. It'll be over soon. Only 15 minutes left. I can't believe we got such a late start." Everyone protested distantly before they grunted, and the woman, Mrs. Clark, bellowed around gunfire. Victor jumped and everyone on deck fell to their bellies or scattered as she stomped barefoot onto the deck and opened fire on the creature. "Well done!" Ewan laughed. "Face your fears, Mrs. Clark. Send the serpent back into the deep." "Shut up!" she shouted, punctuating it with a flurry of bullets. Ewan smiled and sipped his drink as the snake twitched and hissed at her, razored teeth emerging from bloody gums. Mrs. Clark shuddered as the gun drooped, but then she panted and her face twisted into something ugly. The gun rose. Bullets flew as she screamed, in English and Italian, stomping closer to the serpent as she held down the trigger. The sea serpent winced and jerked back, red weeping between its scales. It hissed and snapped, lunging once and catching bullets in its mouth that sent it arcing back in a voiceless scream. It rose like a tower for an instant, almost beautiful as a breaching whale, before it crashed backward into the water. Mrs. Clark rushed to the side, still shooting, until there was nothing left. She panted, stepped back, and threw down the gun. The guests slowly emerged from their hiding places, some clapping while others asked after her. She waved them away to look up at Ewan and curse him. He raised his glass with a smile. "Very good, Mrs. Clark. You've conquered your fear. Now, there will be a moment of respite before we enter the second house." "What is going on?" another old man demanded. Ewan sighed with a smile. "Let's take it from the top then, shall we?" House 3. With everyone on deck and facing Ewan, his staff, human and not, stood at his back, still armed. He held his face high and authoritatively, hands waving and body loose like he were explaining a funny story on a trip he'd taken. No one laughed or asked any questions either, except the ginger man. He never stopped. He'd ask and listen and ask another and another. Then he'd ask the same questions, and then again. Then Victor blinked, his face hollowed, back hunched. Minute by minute, the ginger man aged before them as Ewan checked his watch and nodded, pulling up the cards and moving one to the back. He announced they'd entered the second house, and Mr. Gregory was confronting his fear, senility. And that he had. But it took 30 minutes. His memory went as his body failed, then his anger welled as he swatted anyone who came near him before he'd look around, confused, and begin to cry. The moment someone comforted him, he'd scream. Then he fell and cried in pain before he tried crawling away. Ewan had his staff carry him to his room, leaving the rest of the guests on deck and gawking, screaming another round of questions that Ewan answered as he led them inside to a ballroom. Question after question, drink after drink, Ewan kept his head and his face as Victor kept quiet in the back and watched him check his watch. Finally, Ewan clapped his hands and announced that they'd entered the third house. Victor couldn't keep quiet anymore. Who's next then? He swallowed, pocketing his hands in the bar stool. How does that work? When am I? The order is determined by the order of your replies. The first faces their fear first, and the last is last. He held up the stack of cards, waving the first one in the air before moving it back. The next is Mr. Hughes. Deathly afraid of strangulation, I'm afraid. The old man bolted up, eyes wide and face flashing between anger and nerves. He opened his mouth to say something before the air cracked like a whip and everyone turned to stare at the length of rope now on the floor. The old man jumped and screamed, teetering as he waved his arm and pulled on the rope lashed around it. No, at the hand grown out of the rope. Everyone jumped back at another crack before rope shot out and wrapped his other wrist, a living hand clawing at his jacket sleeve. Mr. Hughes screamed and begged for help, stumbling as another length of rope caught his shoulder, then hip, then ankle, all coming through the same door. He begged, falling on his knees before Ewan, pulling on his shirt as he wept, but their host only took his hand. I have no control here. You must face your fears. When your hour is done, so will be your nightmare. Ewan's eyes fell onto one of the hands, a woman's hand, and followed the rope as it slithered back through the door. The old man jerked at the tug and gasped, tears falling off his plump face before the hands rippled with muscle and tendon and the ropes went taut. He gasped as he fell backward, then reared up with strength Victor didn't believe he had, straining, veins bulging as he screamed. The ropes squeezed hard as another cracked the air. A hand slapped his face, feminine fingers reaching inside and pulling him back by the roof of his mouth. He gagged and grunted, slamming to the floor as two more hands shot out. Then, with a pitiful plea, the ropes jerked him out the hall and down the corridors. Victor leapt up, wide-eyed and panting as the old man screamed and clawed at the floor, the walls, anything to keep him in the ship. But there was nothing that kept the hands from dragging him down the halls and past the staff, exploding onto the side of the ship. The old man screamed like his nails were ripped out. Then he struck the rails and went quiet as they pulled him overboard with a splash in the flat, black water. "Light!" Victor screamed, slamming into the rail and nearly falling after the old man to lean over the edge. He bobbed in the water for a moment before something dragged him out, water slapping his face and rousing him back into a thrashing fit. He screamed and swam against the pull of the ropes before they jerked up from the water, disappearing in the solid gloom outside the ship light. The old man's screams cut short as he flew up, arms held wide by the ropes as the air cracked like gunfire, hands flying from the darkness until he was spread eagle and more rope than man. A final rope cut his screams short, lashing his throat, squeezing like a snake with the rest. His face went red as he sputtered and thrashed uselessly. "Face your fear, Edward!" Ewan called from the balcony above, but Victor couldn't look away as the old man gasped and choked, eyes bulging, tongue jutting out corpse-like. For an instant, the old man became his grandfather, gasping and thrashing on his sickbed. The next, he saw himself laying in a coffin with a mask of terror beside his grandfather and father. Then Edward lurched up into the gloom without a sound, and everyone stared. "Where'd he go?" Victor whispered, then screamed it, whirling up at Ewan and scowling. But their host didn't look down, just leaned a hand on the railing and sipped his drink as he stared into the starless black. "He's gone for now. He'll be returned by hour's end." Ewan sipped his drink and sighed, golden eyes dark and face sinking deeper into thought until he almost looked disgusted. "How do you know that?" Mrs. Clark asked, stomping onto the open deck to better stare at him. "Because that, Mrs. Clark, is the nature of things here. Your fears faced, you are returned." He sipped his drink, then walked to face her. "You might not want to stand there." "Why? Will I get ropped up next?" Something crashed onto the deck a few feet behind her with a dead thud. She jumped and screamed, rushing into the sitting area before she peeked around and cursed a fiery stream up at Ewan, who only laughed and motioned to the dark, wet lump. "Because he's like to be sent back around there." Victor crept into the open, staring at the crumpled heap of Edward's soaking wet, fat body. "He's dead." Everyone stirred, repeating it or cursing and rushing for the sides. "Martin!" Ewan called, and the young man emerged with the team. "See Mr. Hughes to his room so he doesn't wake up uncomfortable." Then he motioned to the one rushing for the rails, and a horse-headed man clopped over and lifted him like he were a mannequin. "Wake up!" Victor hissed. "He's dead!" "Is that gonna happen to all of us?" the man asked from the horse-headed thing's grasp. "This is a sea of nightmares," Ewan said, gesturing around. "You cannot die in a dream. Whatever happens here will see itself done with your hour, and you'll wake from the nightmare so someone else can face theirs." "So, the other one, Mr. Henrik is awake, but has requested to stay in his quarters, which you're all welcome to do if desired." With that, the staff took Edward's body, as everyone made best with the half hour they had until the next nightmare. They drank, they wept, they sat in a corner, someone even meditated. No one prayed, though, even Victor. If ever he would start, why not now? But before he could say anything, Ewan stepped on deck, drink replaced with his stack of cards as he checked the time, announcing they'd enter the next house very soon. House 6. The next 2 hours didn't fly past, but Victor didn't remember much of them, mind fixed on a shifting image in the back of his head. His father fell back, standing healthy at first and sinking into a skeleton until he lay in his coffin. Then his grandfather beside, then he saw himself, The earth yawned as they crept into the shadow, dirt falling over them until the grave mouth was shut and all three were buried. Only they weren't dead. They shifted uncomfortably before they pried their glued eyelids open and reached inside to unhook their jaws to scream and claw at their graves. It played over while the woman screamed, rushing around the deck as a massive gray dog bounded after her. His unseeing eyes stared at the floor of the sitting area, unmoved, drink still in hand and untouched, as the woman leapt off a balcony and rolled on deck. He stared as the dog followed with a heavy thud, tall as a horse and snarling with fangs like sabers. It snapped at her. Then she snarled and spat, rushing around something long and slender in her hands. It cracked the creature's head with a metallic ring. Then came the gurgling and ripping sounds. He didn't know what happened in the end. He just sat next to the bar and ground his teeth, flashing between vision and memory of Ewan's face. People came and went to join him, tried to talk, but he never paid attention. Just sat and drank and stared until they left or fell into their own silence. He never saw what happened in the fifth house, but apparently the man who'd tried to jump the railing slowly turned into a woman, his mother. It would have been funny if not for the man's desperate screams and loathsome shrieks. He vaguely heard someone say something about the man attacking Ewan. That made Victor smile. But the man hadn't gotten far before the bestial staff shoved him away. Then there was a brawl with one of the Minotaurs. It came to a draw, apparently. Victor jumped when a deep horn shook the air. He blinked and looked around, finding himself alone and suddenly desperate not to be. He stood and walked to the side of the ship, finding the ginger man, Mr. Henrik, leaning over the rail of the second deck and watching. They locked eyes before he set his jaw and bowed his head to Victor, who did the same. Mr. Hughes? Awake. He won't come out, though. Mr. Henrik motioned the way Victor had come before the horn came again. Approaching the island. Find the rest at stern. He turned and walked through an open door, shutting it gently. Victor walked to the rear of the ship, sweat beading on his brow and keeping his hair back as he unbuttoned part of his powder blue button-up. Then he found the crowd, many gone, encircling Ewan, as he explained they'd finally reached his island home. "We don't care about your stupid home," the skinny old man, Benjamin, cursed. "We want to go home to ours! So take us round this clod and sail us out." "I'm afraid the island, though my home, is the sixth house. We must make port until the hour's done." Everyone cursed, then found Victor as he approached, face and hands numb as he asked his question. Ewan. Who's next? Their host turned with a tired but kind face, pulling the cards from his pocket. He grinned sadly with a bitter chuckle. Mr. Victor Smith. That would be you. Victor shut his eyes with the breath stuck in his chest. He balled his fists and swallowed the air, finding Ewan's golden stare with a tired, resigned sigh as he wiped his forehead again. So be it. I know my fear, sir. It's already haunted me the whole voyage. It's death, isn't it? I'm sorry to say, yes. He pocketed the cards and set a hand on Victor's shoulder. The conceptual fears are always a mixed bag, my boy. If I knew what to expect, I'd tell you, but only you really know how it'll manifest. Oh, I know. When? They locked eyes. We make port on the hour and leave then, too. Maybe a drink? I've had enough. Let's get this over with. Then he turned and walked to the nose of the ship, leaning on the railing and watching the island. It wasn't hell incarnate. It was a lush, vibrant rainbow of rainforest and jungle, a light from a source unseen above. He breathed deeply, taking in the sweet, wild smells of the flowers and other things, shutting his eyes to wash in the chatter of birds, bugs, and monkeys. Then the ship slowed and lurched to a stop at port, and his eyes crept open. He swallowed, sighed, and brushed off to trudge down the bridge with the few people determined to see the island and their host's mansion home, the one people could never find if they snuck onto the island, and no wonder if it were in this other place. He scowled, then sighed, fire sputtering out as he stepped from wooden dock to sandy shore and the stone slate path leading into the forest. He asked for the time, and Ewan told him it had only been 15 minutes before they moved on. But then the wind blew, and Victor shivered. He gasped and wrapped his arms around himself as the wind stirred, colder than Grabshore. He groaned, falling to his knees, eyes squeezed tight as the wind whispered. "Can you hear that?" he asked, shivering, but no one answered. So he opened his eyes, and fog bled into the forest, swimming around the other's legs as Ewan climbed down and gripped Victor's shoulders. "Face your fear, Victor. Face it on your feet." Victor stared at him with furrowed brows and damp eyes as his grandfather's voice echoed in his head. "Stand up and face your fears, boy. You'll never go anywhere shivering in a corner." Victor's teeth chattered, skin covered in goosebumps as he forced his arms at his sides with a jerky nod and spun, extremities burning and numb with cold as the fog crept up to him. Then Ewan looked over his shoulder and stepped back. Victor turned. A coffin stood upright and open. Darkness, flecked with white, shifted inside. No, not darkness. Dirt, writhing with worms and bugs. Victor stepped back with wide eyes, then stopped with a growl as he panted, balled his fists, and shakily marched up to it. Nothing happened, so he set a white and purple hand on the soil and pressed inside. Kept pushing, until his arm was gone to the shoulder, then the other, his leg. Then he took a deep breath and plunged his face into it, sliding into the wet, dank earth. He opened his eyes against instinct when the feeling of dirt on his skin had left. Then there was only air and black. He swallowed, wondering if this was death, and felt all around, finding the smooth silk of the inside of his casket instead. He swallowed, heart racing as he clawed the fabric, skin bristling and guts churning as everything in him said to fight and claw his way out. He gritted his teeth and whimpered as tears spilled over. He panted, gasped as the air went thin and thinner until nothing good was left. Then he kicked and thrashed. He screamed, begging for someone to open the lid and pull him out. Then, as his eyes shut without permission, he gasped one last time, and his heart spasmed and stopped. All at once, something jerked him up through the darkness. He screamed and writhed, reaching for the thing pulling him, but nothing was there. Then the darkness vanished into a searing light that made him shiver and crumple under the heat. He squinted at it, then gave up, and covered his face as he wept. Something flashed before his face, a light or maybe fire. Between his fingers he spied something like a giant throne with something sitting in it. Then a terrible voice rumbled, "Depart from me." Victor's eyes flew open as he scrambled forward and screamed like a desperate child. He flew back into a blisteringly cold pit and fell, hands clamoring for anything to grab as he screamed and begged and cursed. Anger tried to burn in his chest, but that cold, the fall, it snuffed it out with frozen terror. He shut his eyes and curled up into a ball, screaming so loud he should have torn his vocal cords. Then he opened them amid the screams and found a warm light above in a quaint room of redwood. A goat-headed woman came to his side and eased him down with a man on the other. He panted, flicking between them until it all came back. The ship, the voyage, Ewan, the houses of fear, the island. He swallowed and nodded, shaky hand rising to move them back. "We left the island I take it?" Victor asked with a steady voice, though his eyes were still wide and blank.
"We did,"
the woman said, her voice strange. "And my fear's done. Right?" He looked up to the human man, who nodded. "Yes, Mr. Smith, we'll be taking care of you until you're recovered from your experience. Anything you need, just let us know." Can I be alone for a while?" The goat woman nodded.
"Of course. We'll be outside."
"Just ring this bell if you need us," the man said, motioning to a small bell on the nightstand before they left the room. He sat there, drawing his knees to his chest with silent tears. He cut off his sobs with his mouth against his knees, eyes ever forward. But that passed, and he still sat there, comparing his vision with his fear. He sat there, brows furrowed and jaws clenched until someone knocked. It was the goat woman asking if he needed anything. His voice broke when he said no, but he thanked her anyway. Then he cast off the blankets and sat on the edge. It made sense to stand up, to investigate, walk, appreciate his horror's end. But he just sat there. He didn't think or remember. He sat, hands on his knees, and let it all sink into his bones. Then he blinked and looked around, licking his lips before he stood and took shaky legs to the door. He opened it and found the man and woman either side, looking over their shoulders at him. "Is it over?" he said dryly. "No, Mr. Smith. We're soon to leave the 10th house, however." The man checked his watch and nodded. "I'm going to walk the ship. I think I've taken enough of your time." They asked if he were sure, and he waved them away with a sad smile, only asking where to get a drink of water and following their instructions to the bar. Then he walked, meandered inside, and asked where everyone was. Pointed to the middle of the upper deck, he found the remaining crowd watching a young woman scream inside a large cage, whose domed roof stretched outside the top of the ship. Victor furrowed and stood beside the skinny old man and Mrs. Clark as the young woman cast a huge net into a cyclone of ravens. She yanked it down with a grunt, baring her teeth with wild, teary eyes as she jumped atop and stomped them to death, even as the others came down and pecked and clawed at her. She swatted, flailing her arms before she lost balance and fell back into the cage with a hiss and groan. "Excellent work, Mrs. Breyer. You may come out now." Ewan pulled out a key and unlocked the domed cage as the birds all looked up and cawed madly. He opened the door and helped her out as they took wing and flew through the circular opening at the top. Even the dead birds beneath the net wriggled free to join the murder. He shut the door behind her and asked if she'd like to go to her room, having her escorted when she nodded. "Ewan," Victor said calmly, earning surprised golden eyes. "The creature. You said we're in the mind of a sleeping titan. What does that mean?" "I'm not sure." The rest of the guests, maybe 5, furrowed their brows as he relocked the cage. "Those for whom I work tell me what needs knowing, so I can operate this organization. They keep it imprisoned, and I feed its mind once a year, whether I have participants or not." "How do you feed it if there's no guests?" Victor crossed his arms, head tilted. Ewan smiled wide, but his eyes dimmed. "I'm far older than I look, Victor. Older than you, Benjamin. I've a great many things to keep the Titan entertained where my invitations are lacking." "It only feeds once a year?" Mrs. Clark asked. "Even in dreamtime, that's a while, isn't it?" "A dream may span years and seconds. So, for the beast, you provide months of entertainment. But the time between dreams, the blackness is empty. 1,000 millennia there is but a moment for the sleeping mind." Ewan smiled devilishly and pocketed the keys before he checked his watch and brought out the cards. From its perspective, it hardly waits a few minutes between these stunts. Now, we've entered the 11th house, and the affrighted is Miss Allison Jeffries. House 11. She was a short, athletic woman with black hair back in a messy bun. Her dress, once gorgeous and flowing white silk, was torn, stained, and draping loose around her. She went straight at her name, hands finding the cross at her neck as she gulped and flitted eyes across every face. "And hell is her fear," Ewan said with pursed mouth and sigh. "This one's different every time, I swear. Martin! Make sure everyone's armed!" Ewan moved around the group, motioning them with him as they moved through the ship. "Already done, sir," Martin answered from somewhere. "Ballista have been brought out to boot. It seemed appropriate for this one." "Really?" Ewan chuckled and picked up into a sprint. "Goodness, Allison, what have you dreamt up hell to be?" He laughed as they went, Allison lagging behind, until they came onto the rear deck of the ship. The horizon was a haze of mountains and hills in every direction, backlit with flickering firelight. Smoke bellowed in the distance and rivers flowed down peaks, some aglow and some boiling. The sea shivered and rippled around the hull as shapes climbed in the air on wings of all types. But the longer Victor watched, the darker the lights became. They were brighter than the oblivion before, but they were scant more than a black night on Earth.
"Help me!"
Someone screamed from the water.
"Bring me up!"
Came another, and another until a chorus of groans surrounded them. When Victor crept to the railing, he lurched and swallowed the vomit back down. He gulped air and held it against the stench of rotten putrefaction looking down at the sea. A mass of roiling, contorted people. They climbed over one another in the black water, coating their rotting, bloated flesh in an oil-like stain. Skin gave way to flesh and bone as their organs slipped from their trunks and added to the muck of the rotting sea, foaming with the dead's bile. Someone heaved, and Victor turned to find Allison bent over beside Benjamin. He went to say something, didn't know what, when a broken cry cracked and something whooshed on the air. Victor spun and yelped as he hit the floor, something twisted, crashing onto deck. Everyone screamed and dashed, even Ewan, as the creature stumbled up onto its 4 legs, feathery wings bent, like they'd been broken too many times and never healed right once. It gurgled something in Latin as it crept up to Allison. She lurched back with a scream, ending in a gag as sulfur, mold, and rot rolled off the creature the same as the floating undead. Ewan uncovered his mouth and pointed. "You'll not escape hell today. Fire!" The staff held their breath or stomached the stench and unleashed a lead shower from all sides. The creature, demon, flinched and screamed like a murdered child, then reared up, lashing out before Allison, wide-eyed and falling, shouted something too fast for Victor to hear. The demon growled down on her, but she repeated it.
"Out of here! The Lord rebuke you, Satan!"
She trembled as she said it, but her voice didn't waver. The demon screamed, first at her, then into the air, before it launched limping back to the dark, burning horizon. But there were others. Twisted spirits flew from the mountains and hills, kept at bay by gunfire, but only repelled when Allison commanded them back, even if she was a trembling mess through it all. They hated her, like she were an angel. But not just the demons, the rotten undead too, climbing over one another like disjointed ants until they breached the railing and flopped onto deck. They begged for the safe passage out of hell, weeping and screaming that they've suffered enough, cursing God. But they too stood down when Allison ordered, until they waned, and the darkly burning horizon became the familiar wall of oblivion once again. House 12. Everyone panted where they'd hidden or set up to fight with the staff, breath echoing in the sudden quiet ringing in Victor's ears. Then Benjamin screamed, pointing to another spirit standing on deck. "Kill it! Order it away!" Allison stepped forward, mouth open to speak before Ewan interrupted her. "No. We've entered the 12th house. Your nightmare's done, sweetling, well done. Mr. Benjamin Gorling, this is yours." "Mine? What? A boy? What are you then? Speak!" But the figure wouldn't turn, keeping his back to Benjamin. "Speak, I said!" The boy was slender like the old man, with short hair and in a uniform. Benjamin huffed and stalked forward, hand on the thing's shoulder as everyone warned against it, and spun the spirit to face him. "At least look at me if you'll torment me." But when he turned, there was only more back. No face or chest or throat, as if it had rolled all the way around. Then Benjamin stepped back and squinted. "Wait. I know you. Oh." He gasped and lurched a breath rather than sob, covering his mouth and reaching out. He stepped closer and stopped. "Artie. My Arthur." He grimaced and set a shaking hand on the boy's back, no more than a teenager. "Why are you here? I don't fear you. I love you, my boy." But the figure said nothing. Benjamin rounded on him, but pouted when he got to the other side. Nothing had changed from Victor's vantage, but Benjamin said it was still the back of his head. He rounded his boy again and again, desperation becoming anger. "Why will you not face me?"
I tried,
came a ghostly whisper. Victor froze as goosebumps washed over his skin, the voice like breath settling over every inch of him.
I called you. I came. You never saw me, Father.
"My boy, I never... I'm sorry." Tears fell as Benjamin trembled. He leaned on his son's back, gasping and sobbing into the military coat before his son reached backward. It was careful, gentle, drawing Benjamin's eye as their fingers laced.
You couldn't face me when I lived, Father, and you cannot face me now. Yet you cannot bear to lose me. You must release me, Father, or we both shall be dead, even as you breathe.
Benjamin gave a stunted sob, then looked down, squeezing his son's hand as he nodded with a resigned sigh and embraced him. They stood there for a long moment before Benjamin sniffled, wiped his nose, and backed away with a nod. "Goodbye, my boy. I'll live. For you, Artie. I'll live." Victor couldn't say how long they'd stood there watching Arthur's ghost, but when he vanished into a shimmering mist, Ewan respectfully said they'd left the 12th house. They were in the waking world again, and heading for Grabshore like they'd rounded the island instead of sailed straight. "You said we couldn't go back." Victor pointed to the shore, gasping suddenly at a razor wind off the ocean before he lashed himself with his arms. "Indeed. Well, straight paths in the mind, I found, are round trips in reality." Ewan grinned, pocketing his hands as he watched Grabshore approach. "My guests, I'm sorry for having opened your eyes, but in this, there have been doors opened in the waking too. You've faced torment. Now, face the meager world. And, should you want it, there is a society of like persons, who voyaged their fears or else know things about it and my employers. Reach out." He winked at Victor. "Perhaps you'll find your niche there."